Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the Centering Equity in Corporate Purpose webinar. I'm Bobbi Silten, Managing Director of the Shared Value Initiative, a global platform for leaders seeking to address societal challenges with business solutions. We're one of 3 initiatives that are housed within FSG, a global mission-driven, not-for-profit consulting firm that partners with foundations and corporations to create equitable systems change. We have a global audience here today, and I want to thank all of you for being here. I also want to take a moment to thank our sponsors for the 2022 Shared Value Initiative Speaker Series, Discovery, Enel, Merck, Truist, Walmart, Abbott, and Sanofi. Through their leadership and generosity, we're able to bring you this event and the entire speaker series to the general public free of charge. And we want to take a moment to thank them for their commitment to advancing equity. As the world calls on the private sector to play a pivotal role in creating more equitable outcomes for society, we are releasing the Centering Equity in Corporate Purpose Guide that explores the imperative for business leaders to create equity and put it at the center of corporate purpose, and how doing so transforms the way companies develop and deliver strategy. We'll provide information for downloading the guide later in the session. I'm joined today by 2 of the co-authors, Dane Smith and Nikhil Bumb, as well as Shawnee Harris of Prudential Financial, Patrice Matchaba of Novartis, Mark Kramer of Harvard Business School, and they were all contributors to this guide. So before we get into the guide itself, I thought I could share a little bit about the genesis of this work. Our work began in the summer of 2020 as we were witnessing the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities in the United States, and in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and the outcry over systemic racism that pervades life in America and other forms of systemic oppression around the world. During that summer, we, the Shared Value Initiative and Shared Value Consulting leads at FSG, we were asked an important and uncomfortable question. Is shared value contributing to greater equity, or is it helping to hold inequities in place? This question became a catalyst for this effort, and so began an interrogation of shared value and corporate purpose and their relationship to equity. When we speak of equity, we are speaking of all forms of equity, including racial equity, but also gender, religious, economic inclusion, and other forms of equity. We are also looking at equity from a global perspective, as shared value and corporate purpose are practiced around the world. We must underscore that this work reflects our current best thinking, but we still have much more to learn and unlearn as we do this work. And we also couldn't have made the progress that we did without the work of others who have been advancing equity for years and in some cases decades. We are grateful to the leaders and institutions that have shared their knowledge with us. As the moral imperative to advance equity has also become a business imperative, companies will need to be deeply involved in driving positive change, starting with their corporate purpose. This will require companies to integrate equity into the core business with the goal of contributing to the long-term success of business and society. Putting equity at the center of corporate purpose is a big step for any company, and doing so will require companies to change the way they develop and deliver strategy. But this is not a separate equity strategy, but a business strategy that integrates equity. To help practitioners make this transition and to seek different inputs into the strategy process, which will frame, we hope, new choices, we've identified 5 key practices. These practices are designed to help build awareness about equity issues that matter most to the business, understand why the issues exist, and where to invest resources. These practices are also intended to uncover new value drivers and to show how advancing equity can lead to long-term profit and growth. The 5 key practices that you can see on the screen are: first, new materiality; second, equity domains; third, equity alignment; fourth, new value creation; and fifth, a portfolio approach. And we're going to get into each of these in a moment. But let's first look inside the guide. Inside the guide, we provide a description for each practice. And then where appropriate, we have a supporting framework. We provide tips for getting started because we know this is important for practitioners, and a mini case example so you can see how the practice looks in action. We also offer a set of enabling conditions because they are critical to supporting the success of equity strategies, and they're focused on leadership, learning, measurement, and trusted relationships. And we'll get more into those later in the program. But let's first talk about the practices, and let's dive into practice number 1, new materiality. So conducting materiality assessments is now standard practice in business. It helps companies understand the context in which they're operating in and aids them in making choices and setting priorities on their ESG matters. However, traditional materiality assessments often fall short of examining inequities underlying ESG issues and how companies and industries may contribute to or perpetuate these inequities. We believe a new materiality is needed, one that deeply examines a company's perspective from a diverse set of stakeholders to uncover issues of equity that have previously been hidden from the company. A new materiality helps companies discover where disparities exist in their business model, who is impacted by these disparities, and what causes them. In doing so, this helps leaders be in relationship with the problem and the people it impacts before they start to develop solutions. Being in relationship with the problem necessitates that we learn from the experiences of those living with the problem or being denied the opportunity. Let's take a beverage company, for example. They traditionally understand the risk of water and drought to the business because it's a very water-intensive business. When drought occurs, their costs might go up. There might be risk of rationing, community protests, and general disruption to their operations. New materiality would push them to look deeper and look at issues like water insecurity and understand that drought has a disproportionate impact on communities that have been marginalized. New materiality would cause them to consider, as part of their strategy, how they can address the inequities that are embedded in water insecurity, in addition to other operational impacts. Sometimes companies and the industries they are a part of can contribute to creating or perpetuating inequities. And by deeply understanding the problem, being in relationship with the problem helps companies tackle these harmful effects with greater clarity and intention, and allows them to work with communities to help them build their own power and agency as they seek to address the problem. So that's a brief overview of the first practice, new materiality. Now I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, Dane Smith, a managing director at FSG and one of our co-authors of this guide. And Dane's going to walk us through practices 2 through 4. So over to you, Dane.
Thanks so much, Bobbi. I particularly liked what you said about the importance of companies finding ways to be in relationship with the problem of inequity. Our experience is that if companies and their leaders do not go out of their way to be in relationship with the problem, then they will be limited in their understanding and are likely to lack the creativity to contribute to new solutions. One of the things we have observed among many companies, even those that have declared publicly that they are committed to advancing equity, is that there is a lack of specificity about what elements of inequity they are going to commit to help change. So the second practice is to identify what we are calling equity domains. It's not enough to commit to, let's say, health equity or economic equity. If you think you want to focus on socioeconomic mobility or financial inclusion, what are the specific elements you're going to tackle? Is it access to affordable credit? Is it innovating to develop new products and services that are inclusive? Is it creating new ways to earn the trust from communities that have been marginalized? Be specific about what you're trying to do with your equity domain. To get there, to find your equity domain, it requires a combination of understanding where are there deep intersections between inequities and your business, and discovering where you can have the most impact. But a critical piece of this is that companies cannot just decide for themselves what their equity domain should be. They need to be in deep dialogue with stakeholders as they decide their equity domains. Companies cannot simply choose to avoid the hard things, such as perhaps providing a livable wage when you perceive your competitiveness as relying on the low cost of labor. You can't cherry pick the easier areas that don't cause as many problems for your business. A question that companies probably need to ask themselves is the following. Is there something about your business that other actors consistently identify as perpetuating inequities? If so, that likely must be one of your equity domains, as hard as it might be. I'll just note that one of the tests of whether you are in relationship with the problem is whether you are having a lot of those hard conversations with stakeholders. When you are in relationship with the problem, you are driven to ask stakeholders what their perspective is so that you can see aspects of the problem that you have never noticed before. We call the third practice equity alignment. This is all about choosing how you are going to catalyze change, how you are going to lead. With equity alignment, you can use a set of equity building blocks to examine your activities and determine where you can lead. A key idea here is that companies that are leading and advancing equity are doing it at a number of different levels. They might be meeting expectations by complying with the standards of their company, their partners, their stakeholders. They might be adopting best practices that are being used by the leaders in their sector. They might be taking a hard look at the fundamentals of their businesses and making sure that they are eliminating all of the harmful practices in their business and in their supply chains that are holding inequities in place. Or they might be breaking new ground, innovating to create new best standards for their company or for their sector. The thing is that companies can't just choose to do one or two of these. Companies that are committed to being leaders in advancing equity need to be doing all of it. They can't wait to find ways to innovate until they ensure that they are meeting expectations. And they can't choose to innovate in some areas without doing the necessary work to eliminate harmful practices. It really has been exciting to see some companies, including some of you that are on the call today, recognize that they need to go beyond focusing on making impact in their philanthropy with their foundations and look to make fundamental changes in their business operations as well. The next practice is new value creation. And my colleagues, Bobbi and Nikhil, are going to laugh at me because I have to tell you, this is my favorite practice. Yes, advancing equity sometimes does have a cost. But what very few companies realize is that advancing equity can create enormous value for their companies as well. Very few companies are finding those opportunities. And frankly, in many cases, it's either a lack of imagination or a lack of courage. It is unfortunate that more companies are not recognizing new value creation. While companies undoubtedly need to accept that there will be new costs for them in writing inequities, if they are really going to lead and create impact at scale, they need to find ways to advance equity that create business value as well. To succeed at doing this, they need to change a number of their mindsets, especially related to the who, the what, and the when. For the who, companies need to think deeply about 6 stakeholder groups and how to create and capture value with them by addressing equity issues. It might be through developing new products and services for communities that are suffering inequities. Or it might be developing new programs that help employees become more productive by removing inequities. Or it might be engaging communities in a different way. It might even be about crafting partnerships with government and regulators to collaborate on removing inequities. If companies are not creating and capturing value with these 6 groups, then they are likely missing something very important. For the what, we find that many companies are horribly confused about tangible and intangible value. What's the difference between the two? What's the potential complementarity between the two? And what is the importance of being specific about what they are trying to achieve? We find that too many companies are willing to be satisfied with some sort of vague notion of improved reputation instead of applying the necessary rigor to understand how addressing inequities can create measurable value with customers and employees and partners. Companies also need to redefine timeframes for capturing value. No company is going to capture value in a financial quarter or even in a year. But companies that are disciplined about developing long-term strategies and deep partnerships can transform themselves and transform their businesses. Now I'm going to pass it over to Nikhil to talk about our 5th practice.
Thanks, Dane. And I absolutely did chuckle when you said that practice 4 is your favorite, as I know it is. But I have to say that practice 5 is actually my favorite. And it's about companies taking a portfolio approach. Now, companies need to deploy a whole range of tools to advance equity within their domains. And a deep and ongoing understanding of your equity domains, of really being in relationship with the problem, leads companies to a thoughtful, consistent, and coherent combination of solutions, ranging, as Dane said, everything from philanthropy to shared value. When it comes to equity, we find that few companies are working hard to think about shared value opportunities to create a competitive advantage to integrate how they're addressing equity into their core business model. And this is a shame, because not only does shared value represent a way for companies to create business value from helping to address inequities, it also pushes companies and leaders within companies to be in relationship with the problem in a different way. When companies are thinking deeply about the intersection of the social problem with their business, when they are trying to think about new products and services, new ways to operate, new partners in their supply chain, new ways to engage the ecosystem to shift the conditions that are underlying and holding the problem in place, they come to understand the nuances of the problem, the nuances of the inequities, and the nuances of the system in a different way. And we find that that can be transformational for companies. We would say that no company can truly lead in advancing equity if they are not working hard to develop shared value strategies, but also keeping in mind that shared value in and of itself is not enough, and they will need to address the inequities through other parts of their portfolio as well. Let's take the example of a life sciences company. As Bobbi noted at the start of the call, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the gross inequities in healthcare, not just in the US, but globally. Life science companies are thinking about equitable access and the commercialization strategies for products much more seriously than ever before. And many are struggling, while others are also making significant headways. One company recently asked us to help them with the commercialization strategy for a new therapy. And it was the first time that they had considered equity in commercialization, in particular for an infectious disease product. In this process of working together, a few things became clear. First, advancing equity is not a siloed effort or an add-on to existing commercial tactics. It needs to be integrated across all commercial tactics. Thinking about advancing equity, secondly, thinking about advancing equity through shared value helped the company realize why they needed to rethink and take a new approach to value creation, what Dane was just talking about in practice 4. And third, that shared value by itself was not enough for the company to advance equity. Companies need to have strategies that also include some things that will be at net cost. some things that will come at cost neutral, and some things that will have a return. Through shared value, companies will come to realize that there are other ways that they can have impact. And that there might be some things that they cannot tackle with shared value alone. There may be some things that are requiring for them to be more authentic, more catalytic, to think about how they may use their advocacy, their partnership, their policy, their philanthropy in a different way to unlock other parts of the system that are preventing them from making meaningful impact or meaningful advances towards equity, all to maximize the impact that they have or that they are having on systems level change. So to recap, there are 5 practices to centering equity in corporate purpose. The first that Bobbi talked about is a new materiality, really taking a stakeholder-informed view that goes much beyond traditional materiality to put companies in relationship with the problem and understanding what matters now. The second practice is identifying your equity domains and choosing where amongst those you have the opportunity to create change, which may also mean really pushing you, as Dane said, into uncomfortable spaces that you traditionally have not want to been in. Third is equity alignment, and as again, identifying how you deliver change, how you think about innovation, but also meeting expectations, adopting best practices, and addressing fundamentals. And then fourth, new value creation and expanding your opportunities. And finally, bringing all of that holistically together with a portfolio approach in terms of deploying a set of solutions that work together in a consistent and coherent manner to advance equity and systems change. Now, beyond the practices, while this guide really focuses on strategy, in addition to the 5 practices, our research also uncovered and underscored the importance of enabling conditions. Advancing equity is about much more than just strategy. Strategy is a critical element to centering equity in a company's purpose, but it is insufficient on its own. We all know that the best laid strategies don't come out to fruition if they aren't accompanied by a container, a company culture that really enables them to succeed. And centering equity in a company's purpose requires embedding equity into the very fabric of the company's culture so that every day employees are showing up thinking about how they are working to dismantle those systemic barriers and how that relates to their day job. That's what these enabling conditions are about. A strategy centered in equity cannot be fully realized without an investment in changing the conditions within the organization that do so, that embed equity into the company's fabric, the company's culture. Overwhelmingly, our research highlighted 4 key enabling conditions. First, leadership with authenticity and values anchored in equity. Bringing to life a corporate purpose centered on equity cannot happen without the senior-most leaders and executives embodying these principles of authenticity, humility, and courage, and making sure that they are giving adequate time to equity to their own learning journeys and centering it in how they talk in all forums, whether those are investor meetings or employee town halls. The second enabling condition is comprehensive learning and reflection to advance equity. While senior leaders need to prioritize their own learning and inner work on equity, companies also need to make a commitment to investing in the learning on equity for all employees, to make an ongoing commitment to reflection, and to challenging existing norms and mindsets through difficult but productive dialogue and education. The third enabling condition is intentional measurement that drives accountability on equity. We've all heard the saying that what gets measured is what gets managed. A true commitment to equity means an investment in measuring it. Investing in measuring progress against your equity ambitions, while challenging, is critical, and linking these measures to performance helps companies maximize their impact. And our fourth and final enabling condition is connection and trust through reimagined relationships. This condition anchors in the human element, because at the end of the day, addressing and advancing equities is about the people. And anchoring in people and relationships will help your staff, teams, and business transform themselves, to transform your practices and processes to become more inclusive and to build a safe, welcoming environment for employees, for customers, for communities and partners, and all of your stakeholders as part of a collective to advancing equity. We're very fortunate today to have two incredible corporate leaders with us to share about the importance of these enabling conditions in bringing equity work to life within their own companies. I'd first like to introduce Shawnee Harris. Shawnee is Vice President of Social Responsibility and Partnerships at Prudential Financial. And in case that wasn't enough, Shawnee is also the President of the Prudential Foundation. She is a member of the Senior Leadership Team for Inclusive Solutions, a Prudential business function that harnesses the power of capital markets to drive financial and social mobility, inclusive economic opportunity, and sustainable growth. Shawnee has been a courageous leader both within Prudential and outside of the company to help understand how to advance equity, what conditions are needed internally, and then how ambitious the company can be to try to right inequities within their products and services. Shawnee, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm excited to hear from you more about the first two enabling conditions, the importance of leadership, that leadership with authenticity, humility, and courage, and of creating this, and the importance of creating the space and imperative for continuous learning in order to advance equity, including examples of how this looks like at Prudential. How are you encountering this on a day-to-day basis?
Well, thank you so much, Nikhil. And thank you for that warm introduction. I am so really happy to join all of you today. And I'm also really pleased that FSG and the Shared Value Institute has produced a resource for leaders like me who are on a journey to help our companies become more impactful in advancing greater equity in society. At Prudential, we are proud to say that we are a purpose-driven company. And we believe our purpose is to make lives better by solving the financial challenges of our changing world. But the work of advancing equity, which is very much connected to realizing our purpose, has primarily been seen as a responsibility of our CSR function. Prudential was founded in Newark, New Jersey in 1875, and we have always had a deep connection to our headquarters city. In the aftermath of the civil and racial unrest in the late 60s, significantly shaped how Prudential thought of social responsibility. In that aftermath, we established and formalized our impact investing and philanthropic programs. And over the past 40 years, we have focused our investments on strategies that help remove systemic barriers for underserved communities and accelerate access to economic opportunity. Through our place-based work in Newark, we have learned to authentically partner and co-create solutions with community leaders, to embed ourselves as a member of the Newark community, and to be actively aware and manage the power dynamics that come with this work. And our employees and our senior leaders are very proud of our commitment to communities like Newark and our commitment to addressing inequity. However, although we have had a great reputation for our leadership and our community investments, we have lacked a collective vision and understanding on how we could center equity in our business strategy and truly become a purpose-led company where our thinking and decision-making as a company is informed by our purpose. It actually took another crisis, the global pandemic, and the bright line of disparity that was painfully demonstrated in 2020 through the lens of race to help accelerate our understanding that our company's commitment to equity cannot be limited to just our CSR practices. In the aftermath of 2020, Prudential, like other companies, announced commitments to advance racial equity. However, unlike other companies that focus those commitments solely on investments in communities of color, we saw an opportunity to integrate equity into our core business practices. As a result, our racial equity commitments span the company's talent practices, how it designs and delivers its products and services, and its support of institutions working to remove persistent obstacles to Black economic empowerment. And as we have deepened our commitment to equity through these long-term actions that we hope will embed equity into our core business strategy, I think it's important to reflect on, how Prudential is doing to foster some of those enabling conditions that were outlined in the report that are critical to the success of a strategy centered on equity. So the first two enabling conditions, again, are leading with authenticity and values anchored in equity, and creating a culture of learning and reflection to advance equity. And when reflecting on our journey over the last few years, I think one of the areas that I really believe we've made progress on as it relates to the two enabling conditions is demonstrating a strong commitment to this work at the most senior levels of the company. Our racial equity commitments were not created in isolation, but were born out of the courageous candor of nearly 7,000 Prudential employees who shared their experiences and expectations in more than 125 employee forums on racial equity across the company. The forum first was led by Prudential's Black employees a few days after the nation witnessed the tragedy of George Floyd and the social unrest that followed. Over 4,000 employees participated in the town hall that was attended by Prudential CEO Charlie Lowry and our entire senior leadership team. And the meeting set the tone for and the expectation that senior leaders would continue conversations across all business groups, which helped to shape how we think about equity in our business practices, and also enable the allocation of resources for R&D capital to invest in new ventures that allowed us to better meet the needs of diverse consumers, beginning with helping more Black Americans gain access to financial tools and solutions that build wealth. In embarking on this work, we also created opportunities for reflection and employee learning on issues of equity, beginning with an all-employee meeting that again was led by our CEO, that acknowledged Prudential's own legacy in leading industry practices that historically stripped wealth from communities of color through race-based underwriting and redlining. Those conversations have not always been easy, but I appreciate our leaders' willingness to create safe spaces, to address difficult issues, and to encourage a culture that challenges conventional thinking in order to drive change. However, as I shared in the beginning of my comments, we, like many, are on a learning journey and there's still a lot more work to be done. Some of the areas where learning still needs to happen at Prudential is understanding that we have bias baked into our business strategy and practices. And that bias often reflects how we think about customers and prevents our ability to effectively reach diverse customers, our customers who have historically not been served by mainstream financial services institutions like Prudential. So a big part of our work ahead is helping the company build new partnerships and capabilities that help accelerate our learning, cultural intelligence, and insights to expand our thinking on what makes a viable Prudential customer, and to embed those new capabilities more deeply within the company beyond senior leadership engagement and buy-in. And lastly, we know that in order to do this work effectively requires a new way of working together internally as a company. That instead of operating in silos, we have to develop an integrated approach to showing up differently to make authentic, interactive, and meaningful connections that help us expand our addressable market, while also providing more people with access to the tools and solutions that build generational wealth. So thank you again for allowing me to share a bit of our journey at Prudential, and I will hand it back to Nikhil.
Thank you, Shané. I really appreciate your vulnerability and what you shared about Prudential's journey, how the work originally primarily sat in the CSR function and how your leadership is challenging itself to do better and embed equity into the core business strategy. That's exactly the authenticity and humility we talk about when we speak about leadership for equity. And you also talked about the interplay between the leadership's role and the courageous candor of, I think you said nearly 7,000 Prudential employees. That's something that's just sitting with me and is really standing out to me. So thank you again for sharing so openly and transparently. This is a perfect segue to hearing more about our third and fourth enabling conditions. Next, we're joined by Dr. Patrice Matchaba from Novartis. Patrice is the head of U.S. corporate responsibility of Novartis, and similar to Shané, also serves as the president of the Novartis U.S. Foundation. He has played an instrumental role in helping integrate the Novartis Access Principles, where the company seeks to make its medicines and healthcare solutions accessible to all, regardless of geography, income, or limitations of local health systems. I'm excited for Patrice to share more about the Novartis Access Principles, but before I hand it over to him, I have to say that in my conversation with Patrice, one thing that stands out is the way he simultaneously balances that advancing health equity is both about doing the work for individual patients, but also for global good and global health. Before joining Novartis in 2000, Dr. Matchaba practiced as an obstetrician and gynecologist in Southern Africa. Dr. Matchaba, we'd love to hear more from you about the Novartis Access Principles, how you're measuring progress on equity at Novartis, and the importance of building those trusted, inclusive partnerships.
Thanks, Nikhil, and congratulations, Shané, and congratulations to the FSG team. So I'll give you two enabling conditions that I've been personally involved with. I've been with Novartis now for 22 years. The first one is intentional measurement to drive accountability. So in 2000, we realized that innovating and finding the innovative medicines is useless unless you make it accessible to the 7 billion patients around the world. We started off with a donation model. We donate all the medicines for leprosy to the WHO, but it would almost be impossible to believe that leprosy still exists today, mostly in Brazil and in India and some parts of Africa, close to 200,000 patients per year, including children with deformities. And then we went to a no-profit model with malaria. And still today, you get more than 240 patients who have malaria and close to 600,000 patients die. So with our new materiality and being challenged by Access to Medicine Index, and those of you who know C.K. Prahalad, who wrote the book, The Fortune at the Bottom of the Income Pyramid, we realized that it's not just access to medicines that is important, it is access to innovative medicines that's important. And at that time, I would say around 2012, the time lag from when a drug and an innovative medicine was registered in the US by the FDA or Europe to a low income or middle income was anything between 4 and 10 years. Currently, even today, some pharmaceutical companies don't even register the innovative drugs in the 96 low income and middle income countries. So we got permission from the board, I was involved in that, to start in 2014 to see if we can make all our innovative medicines available to low income and middle income countries within 1 year of FDA registration. Now, it's been extremely successful. To cut a long story short, currently we have a timeline of less than 1 month, less than 1 year. A drug we just launched recently for breast cancer, we launched in the US after FDA approval, and within 1 month launched in a low-income country before even launched in Europe. Now, what has been important about this is that our board fully supports and has integrated access to medicines at the board level. So when I was a group head of global health, I had to go to the board every 4 months and present data on access to our medicines in low-income countries every 4 months. And then at the executive level with Vas as the CEO, this is integrated into the executive committee's balance scorecard, drilled down throughout management. And we've fine-tuned it to a level now where we actually start at the end of phase 2 drug development, because the formulation may be different in the developing country, and we are present in those 96 countries. Now, what we've learned is this: doing good is actually good business. Because what has happened is that this has become a significant part of our portfolio and business. And just to show the confidence we have about the growth in the low income and middle income countries, when the international capital markets set up the criteria for sustainability linked bonds, we were the first pharma company to issue a sustainability-linked bond related to access to medicines. So in 2019, when I was still group head of global health, we went to the European bond markets and raised 3.4 billion and say that our target is a 200% increase of access to patients on innovative medicines from 2020 to 2025. And we say that if we don't meet that target, we're willing to pay a stepped up coupon penalty in 2025. Now, we track this. VAS, as a CEO, has created an ESG office that tracks this in terms of patient numbers, of course, in terms of patient access, in terms of sales and margin. And we track this on a monthly basis. We publish issues within the company. It is discussed at the board level, and all teams are accountable for that. And it's part of the balanced scorecard, and it's been extremely successful. The second example I want to give you of an enabling condition is the value of creating new partnerships and developing trust. Now, like all of you, as Bobbi has said, and the other speakers, after the murder of George Floyd and the impact of COVID on Black and Brown communities, I actually asked my CEO of VAS that I be transferred to addressing the health inequities that are so deeply rooted in the US. So we started this journey last year, and we refrained from issuing a press release initially because we understood that the trust issue is really deep and has been developed over the last 300 to 400 years. We all know about Tuskegee and Henrietta Lacks and so on. So we engaged with the 4 deans of the historically Black medical schools, driven and guided by Professor Montgomery Rice of Morehouse, the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, the National Medical Association representing over 30,000 African-American doctors. And we learned a few things. Trust is the key issue, number one. Without trust, you can't increase the number of Black and Brown patients participating in clinical trials. Second, there are not enough investigators. In most cases, less than 1% of the investigators came from the Black and Brown communities. So we partnered with Thurgood Marshall and created a 10-year program called the Beacon of Hope. It includes over 340 scholarships. It includes over 1,200 3-year mentorships by Novartis scientists to integrate Black and Brown kids into research and development. It includes internship programs that actually start next month at our Discovery Unit in Boston with over 40 kids from HBCUs, fully paid for 3 months. And we're going to do that for 10 years with the intention of creating over 400 research and development scientists in all fields, gene therapy, cell therapies, and messenger RNA. And then finally, it also includes 10 scholarships to HBCU faculty to research on any topic that can reveal the reasons and solutions to health inequity. It could be food deserts, it could be climate change, environment, and health. And then we're taking that data and working with a Congressional Black Caucus to convert that into policy and hopefully funding. Now, it's come at the right time. It also includes creating centers of excellence at the 4 historically Black medical schools, where they articulated to us that the reasons they're not involved in clinical trials from the industry is that they don't have endowments. So their brightest kids don't stay and work in clinical trials. When they complete, they have to go back and earn a capital to support their family. So we launched with Morehouse a 10-year Center of Excellence for Clinical Trials, provided 5 faculty, the professor, a research fellow, and 3 other headcount for a full 10 years, so that they can do trials not only for Novartis, but for all companies. We're concluding the same agreement with Howard, with Charles Drew, and Meharry. We've already placed studies at Meharry, at Morehouse right now, and this has come at the right time, because currently, Congress is now discussing the DEPICT Act, which is going to give the FDA financial and legal responsibility and power to punish companies that don't integrate equity into research and development. The FDA itself, under its new commissioner, Bob Caleb, just 2 weeks ago, released regulatory guidance mandating that all pharmaceutical and biotech companies must have a race and equity strategy starting at the end of phase 2. Now, the impact of this is significant. As I say, doing good is good business. Just in the last 2 weeks alone, 2 companies that had partnered with 2 Chinese biotech companies and had done trials in oncology only in China just last week were rejected by the FDA and have to redo their phase 3 program at a significant cost of close to $200-400 million to redo their phase 3 program. Now, what is important about this is that now that it has become mandatory from the FDA and Congress to have a race and equity strategy and make sure that your populations are representative, the cost per patient in the US because of competition is going to go up for those companies that have not developed trust and partnership with the Black and brown communities. The speed to recruitment is also going to be delayed because of that competition. And more importantly, it's important that our labels are going to be enriched. So in summary, doing good actually is always good business. Thanks, and back to you, Nikhil.
Yeah, thank you, Patrice. Doing good is always good business. It's a powerful way to close out. And it's inspiring to hear about how Novartis is holding itself accountable through the scorecard and the quarterly board checks that you mentioned on these metrics. You know, we hear a lot about measuring on equity. We talk about it a lot, but if I'm being really candid, this is one of the areas where we really see companies struggle. And it's an area where we struggle too. So I'm sure our audience really appreciates the specificity of the examples you shared. And it's also resonating with me the way you spoke about the recognition of trust, Patrice, or rather the lack of trust between marginalized communities, especially Black and brown communities, and how that has informed the way that you've been operating going forward. So thank you. Really appreciate it, Patrice. You know, as we move forward and when I reflect back on Patrice's comments as well as Shané's, I can't help but think about the journey that we've been on at FSG and the Shared Value Initiative. Just like all of you at companies, we're on our own journey. The conversation on equity, on FSG's equity journey, on companies' roles to advance it, particularly on shared value and equity, has advanced significantly in the 5+ years since I've been at FSG. We're now much more explicit about how to link shared value to equity. And I'm sure you see that in the way that we're talking about it publicly now. I've seen the way that these 4 enabling conditions, leadership, continuous learning and reflection, talking more explicitly about how to measure on equity, and reimagining relationships through deep connection and trust, have played a critical role both within FSG and in our external partnerships with companies and clients in terms of how we enable and advance systems level change. But who better to talk about shared values equity journey than Mark Kramer, co-founder of FSG and founder and senior advisor of the Shared Value Initiative. Mark Kramer is a senior lecturer with Harvard Business School. He co-authored the Harvard Business Review article, Creating Shared Value, with HBS professor Michael Porter in 2011, and continues to push global thinking on the role of business in society through his influential research, courses, and publications. Mark, I'm really thankful that you're joining us today and curious to hear your own reflections on what our speakers have shared today, the journey of bringing a more explicit focus on equity into the shared value conversation, and how the roles of business and shared value in advancing equity are changing.
Thank you, Nikhil. And it's great to be with everybody. And it's wonderful to hear the very specific examples that Shané and Patrice brought up as really terrific guides for other companies and other people who are listening in on this webinar. You know, you're quite right, Nikhil. It's been quite a journey for FSG, and I have to say for me personally, to really begin to think about racial equity and to act on it in a more profound way. Bobbi at the outset said that this particular effort began around the time of COVID and George Floyd, when there was tremendously renewed attention to racial equity issues in the US. But the reality is that the journey for FSG began more than 10 years ago, when we first began to think about how issues of racial equity pervaded not just problems out in the world, but pervaded the way we were thinking about things ourselves at FSG. And what I have to say personally is kind of embarrassing, is the fact that I'd been working in the social sector field, working on social change for a good 15 years before that, without really understanding in any meaningful way structural racism and the issues of racial equity. And I know we have people from more than 50 countries listening in on this call. And of course, the question of what group is the disadvantaged group in your country is going to be different by region. But I think, as was the case with FSG and as was the case with most companies in the US, you'll find in your particular region that the leading businesses were started and shaped and run by whatever is the dominant and most privileged group in the population. And that means that the business model and the products and services were developed from the perspective of that privileged group. And that therefore means it also is not well suited to serving the rest of the population and the rest of the world that doesn't inherently have these same set of privileges. And so what this entire process of coming to grips with racial equity for companies is about, in my mind, is rethinking every aspect of our business model to recognize the blind spots that we bring to it, and to, as Nikhil and Dane and Bobbi have said, be in relationship to the problem by really listening and making room to hear those who approach the issues with a different experience. And there are a couple things that make racial equity a more difficult challenge than other social or environmental issues companies address. The first is, it is understanding racial equity and structural racism is very much a personal journey. For me, it was about recognizing the privilege that I had that others did not, in a way that I had never seen before. And going through a personal journey of discovery and acknowledging that whatever success I may have had in the world comes not only from my own efforts and talent, but from the privileges that I was fortunate enough to be born into. That's a difficult realization for many corporate leaders to make. And yet without that realization, it's very hard to tackle racial equity in your company in a meaningful way. Dealing with racial equity in a company also involves a high degree of empathy. I was deeply impressed when I began to study PayPal, the financial payments and transactions company, because they have an intentional purpose around reaching lower income populations. And in order to really understand that market, when an executive joins their team, they give them $20, take away their wallet and cell phone, and drop them off in a low-income neighborhood and say, we'll pick you up in 48 hours. So that these new executives to PayPal at least have some minimal personal experience of what it is like to live without access to financial resources. And of course, we cannot as easily share the experience of what it is like to be Black in America or what it is like to be a disadvantaged population in other countries around the world. It's not as simple as giving somebody $20 in 48 hours. But finding ways to create empathy. And I think the Prudential employee forums that Shané mentioned is one good example, is really important to embedding equity within the company. The last thing I want to talk about is why we might approach an issue that is such a moral imperative as racial equity as a business issue. But I love what Patrice said, that doing good is good business. And it's easy to say that. It's hard to realize that and put it in place in practice. But we have seen again and again, when you pay employees better, when you treat them well, when you create jobs that have a degree of autonomy and responsibility and self-fulfillment, turnover reduces, productivity increases, and you actually end up making more money. Walmart had that experience when they raised entry-level wages to roughly twice the minimum wage in the US. Their costs went up, but their productivity and their turnover went down. And as a result, they had a net increase in profitability. And we see again and again that many of the issues we thought were issues that required philanthropy are actually issues that can increase the success of our business. And when companies address social issues like racial equity through their business model, it is infinitely more powerful than when they do it through philanthropy or through the CSR department. And that kind of power, that kind of commitment, and that kind of innovation is what we need to see in companies, not just in the US, but around the world, if we are going to create a more equitable society. So thank you for letting me be with you this morning. And I'm really, again, thrilled to have heard the examples from Patrice and Shané of what this really looks like in practice. I hope this guide is helpful to you. And I know that Bobbi and the entire team at the Shared Value Initiative and FSG is eager to be of help in any way we can be on your own journeys. And with that, let me turn it back over to Bobbi.
Mark, thank you so much for those comments. And I think importantly, you just modeled vulnerability, what leaders need to do this work. And I think your comment about dominant cultures shaping the opportunities, the products, the rules is another important point that we all need to think about when we sit in a privileged position, regardless of what country you're in. Thank you so much, Mark, for being on the journey with us. Before we wrap up, I just want to call attention to a few Fortune Media related topics. So first of all, on May 18th coming up, we have Alan Murray, CEO of Fortune Media and author of soon to be released book, Tomorrow's Capitalists, My Search for the Soul of Business. Mark Kramer is going to be interviewing him, so please sign up on the SVI website. Also, the call for submissions for the 2022 Fortune Change the World list is now open through July 15th, so you can submit your application on the SVI or Fortune websites. And as I said at the start of this webinar, the world is calling on the private sector to play a pivotal role in creating more equitable outcomes. So we hope with the release of the Centering Equity and Corporate Purpose guide that leaders are going to have some relevant guidance to deliver more equitable outcomes for society and to meet the moral and business imperative of our time. You can download the guide at the URL noted in the lower left corner. And also, we'd love to hear your feedback, so please share it at comments@fsg.org. I want to thank all of our speakers, Dr. Patrice Matchaba, Shawnee Harris, Mark Kramer, and my colleagues, Nikhil, Bumb, and Dane Smith. Thank you to all of you for sharing your powerful perspectives and experiences. I want to send a big thank you to the people behind the camera, Georgie Eckert, Alicia Dunn, Kate Meyer, Jillian Bath, Emily Mosler, Mark Russell, and Gail Gershon, who worked behind the scenes to help create this guide and webinar. And a big thank you to all of you, our audience. Thank you for being here today, for being committed to advancing equity and centering equity in corporate purpose. We hope to see you at another FSG and Shared Value Initiative event soon. Thank you.